Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum. In this video, we'll be taking a deep dive into a couple of ayahs of Surah Yusuf, in particular verses 24 and 94, both of which contain the word Lawlā, and both of which I mentioned in my recent lecture, The Untranslated Quran, and also in my review of Nuh Keller's translation of the Quran, which was released this year in 2022. So before we get into the ayah itself, which has always intrigued me in terms of its translations and then more recently in terms of its tafsirs, I want to take a few steps back into this particle which is called lawla. And to help us, we'll draw on a couple of pieces of writing which I had the honor to translate. The first of which here is from Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, the incredibly important compendium of Quranic sciences by Jalaluddin As-Suyuti. And in his work, he has a chapter, which is chapter 40, or An-Naw' al-Arba'un, in which he summarizes from Mughni al-Labib and Kutub al-A'arib of Ibn Hisham. And that book in particular, or that book itself, we will mention a little bit later on for something that was missed out from this summary by As-Suyuti. But the summary does a great job of letting us know what is this lawla all about. So he says, and I've got the Arabic text in front of me. I've not put it in front of you, but I might refer to it at some points to help clarify what he's saying. So lawla has a number of usages, as do numerous particles in the Arabic language. And he ends up summarizing for us 4 different ways that it has been explained. The first is as a particle for non-occurrence due to occurrence. So he says, أن تكون حرف امتناع لوجود. So that is to say, it tells us that one thing has not occurred because another thing did occur, right? So the best way to understand that is through the example sentences. So he shows us first that it enters upon nominal sentences. So the ayah, or 143 to 144, ولولا أن كان من المسبحين للبث في بطنه إلى يوم يبعثون. So talking about Prophet Yunus, were it not that he was among the glorifiers, he would have tarried in its belly until the day they are raised. So that tells us that he didn't tarry in the belly, he didn't remain there until the day of judgment. Why? Because he was this. So it was the case that he was among the glorifiers. So were it not for X, then Y. And from that we understand that because X does exist, then Y does not exist. So the Y is the non-occurrence due to the occurrence of X. And that's in the normal order of the sentence. Then he says, if it is negated, then it is without the lam. So this is the lam in lalabitha, right? But in this ayah, which is from Surah An-Nur, وَلَوْلَا فَضْلُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ وَرَحْمَتُهُ مَا زَكَى مِنْكُمْ مِنْ أَحَدٍ أَبَدًا. So it just tells you that it's not لَمَا زَكَى when it is in fact negated. This is a negating particle. If lawla is followed immediately by a pronoun, that ought to be a nominative pronoun. Lawla antum, were it not for you, yeah, all of you. And that's in Surah Saba. So that is the first meaning, and that, I hasten to emphasize, is the main meaning, the basic meaning, but we do frequently find it with other usages in the Quran. So the second usage is of the meaning of halla. So what is halla? فهي للتحضيض والعرض في المضارع أو ما في تأويله. So the halla, which he explains as a separate article, is the same meaning here, which is urging an invitation. So for example, لولا تستغفرون الله. So the translation of this would be something like, will you not seek forgiveness? And likewise, لولا أخرتني, will you not reprieve me? But when it's will you not, don't take this as literally a question. What's happening here is one is asking God, or one is asking the people, won't you Go ahead. Go ahead and seek forgiveness from God. Please, God, reprieve me, give me more time. So that's the sense of lawla here in the meaning of halla, which is for tahdid and arud. So it is used with the mudari', but also it can come with the madi, denoting censure and blame, tawbih and tandim. For example, لولا جاءوا عليه بأربعة شهداء. Why did they not produce 4 witnesses for that? So again, although we might translate it, and we often find the translators say it as why not, it is in the sense of blaming them for that fact. لولا جاءوا. Shouldn't they have brought 4 witnesses? They should have brought 4 witnesses. That is what it comes down to. They should have. It is not really a question, although translators might indeed choose to put it into a question kind of format. And so you do sometimes find if only as a translation, right? So here in this, and I believe these translations, if I recall, are taken from Abdullah Yusuf Ali with some adjustment, as I did this some years ago. And this translation, by the way, is not published yet, but will be, inshallah. So if only those whom they set up beside God had helped them. So the ayah, فَلَوْلَا نَصَرَهُمُ الَّذِينَ اتَّخَذُوا مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. So it's not a question why didn't they? It's not a question why didn't they, although some translations may indeed make it seem that way. And likewise, Surah An-Nur again, وَلَوْلَا إِذْ سَمِعْتُمُوهُ قُلْتُمْ. Right? If only you had, upon hearing it, said. If only when suffering came to them from us, and so on. فَلَوْلَا إِذْ جَاءَهُمْ بَأْسُنَا تَضَرَّعُوا. So these are some examples. فَلَوْلَا إِذَا بَلَغَتِ الْحُلْقُومِ. Okay, and there is the apodosis, or the consequence, the jawab of lawla here it comes later on. Okay, and then likewise, why, if you are not at our disposal, do you not restore it? Okay, so there are some various translations of these we won't get into. The third usage, as he says, is للاستفهام. Okay, according to Al-Harawi. Okay, so he says, will you not reprieve me, which was mentioned before, لولا أخرتني, and likewise, لولا أنزل إليه ملك. Why is an angel not sent down to him? So he understood this as questioning, and as you can see in the translations, you might find it with a question mark. But here, as Suyuti says, crucially, however, the apparent sense here is that of halla. So it should be seen as it was explained before, rather than as a question. The fourth usage, again, Al-Harawi mentions this, is for negation, for nafi. And it's important that these things are mentioned because when we go into the deep dive of the tafsir, we might see some of these things being advanced as explanations for another lawla, and we're going to have to check whether it is viable for those lawlas to be any of these things. So Al-Harawi said, فَلَوْلَا كَانَتْ قَرْيَةٌ آمَنَتْ in Surah Yunus. He said that this is of the category of negation, that is to say, not one town believed, i.e. the townspeople, when the punishment came to them such that its belief would benefit it. So that's his understanding of the ayah, that there is a negation. فَلَوْلَا كَانَتْ قَرْيَةٌ. But as Suyuti says here, the majority did not accept this, but rather they took this ayah again as being lawla for censure. That is to say, why didn't they, or they should have, if only they had. Censure for their avoidance of faith until the coming of punishment. And this is supported by the reading of Ubay. Of course, this is a non-canonical reading. It is not in the Mus'haf al-Imam. It is not in the Qira'at Mutawatira. But we have another reading of Fahalla. And then it tells you that it should be seen as having the same meaning as Halla. Upon this interpretation, that is Al-Harawi's interpretation, if it is for Nafi, then Illa Qawma Yunus, would be disconnected. That is to say, the illa would be of the meaning of lakin, of but. So you can look in the Tafsir of Al-Alusi for more details about that. So what you can see here is two usages which are well accepted. That is to say, non-occurrence due to occurrence, امتناع للوجود. And the second possibility is that it's for tahdid and arud. The first of these comes upon the jumla ismiya. The second comes upon the mudari' or the maldi. And especially if it's with the maldi, it's got a sense of censure and blame. Right? Why didn't they do that? If it's in the present tense of the imperfect, then it's like, why don't you go ahead and do that? Right? So it's urging them to actually do it. So there's a beneficial point here, fa'ida, which is mentioned, a narration in which it is said that all lawla in the Quran means halla, which of course is clearly not the case if you take that literally. And there are numerous examples, and here a very important one, which we are going to talk about, ayah 24 of Surah Yusuf. Lawlā ar-ra'a burhana rabbih. The lawla here denotes non-occurrence. Its apodosis is elliptical. He would have a desire to or engaged in intercourse. So that's something that we'll come to in a few moments and see how it was handled in tafsir and also in translations. Likewise, had God not been gracious to us, had we not strengthened her heart, some examples. And this is an important one because we're going to see this also in Tafsir Razi in a moment, inshallah. So, لولا أن ربطنا على قلبها, had we not strengthened the heart of the mother of Musa alayhi salam, then what? She would have exposed the truth. لأبدت به. So that would be understood from what comes immediately before it in the ayah. But we'll come back to this, inshallah. Another narration has it that all Quranic occurrences of falawla, which is with the fa, have the meaning of fahalla, with two exceptions, falawla kanat qaryatun amanat, which is for negation according to this, and falawla an kana min al-musabbihin. Thus it becomes clear that Khalil was referring to lawla when commenced with the fa. Okay, so we don't have to process all of that, but we wanted to get the idea about what is said bil jumla overall about the meaning of lawla, or the meanings rather of lawla. So we come now to ayah 24 of Surah Yusuf, and I'm going to take as the study tool here the tafsir of Fakhruddin al-Razi. Like the preceding work from Asyuti, this is something that I've translated and has informed my thinking about the tafsir. Al-Razi goes into considerable detail under this ayah. In the other ayah 94, he actually doesn't go into any detail about lawla there. So I thought I'll use him where I can. So this ayah, of course, is one in which the story is being told of the wife of the Aziz, in whose house Yusuf was staying, and how she advanced upon him. And after calling him, and saying to him, haytalak, and him refusing, the next ayah tells us, وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ. She certainly desired him. That's one way to translate it. And then وَهَمَّ بِهَا, which by itself would mean, and he desired her. And then we have لَوْلَا أَرَّأَى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. Were it not that he saw the evidence of his Lord. There's lots of different ways to understand individual elements of this ayah, and that's not our concern at the moment. But we're interested in the structure of this sentence and this ayah. And therefore, is hamma biha telling us that he did have this ham or this desire for her? Or is it telling us that he would have were it not for this other thing happening? So is lawla here functioning as non-occurrence due to occurrence? And if so, does that mean that the ham did not occur because this, seeing the burhan of his Lord, did occur? That is one of the interpretations. The other interpretation is hamma biha is a statement of fact, just like the one before it. وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا, that this should be taken together. And then لَوْلَا أَرْرَآ بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ has to be understood with something following it. So were it not that he saw the proof of his Lord, then something would have happened, right? So actually these are both views that are accepted in tafsir, and that doesn't mean that outrageous things are attributed to Yusuf alayhi salam. In fact, yes, some of the mufassirin did attribute things, unworthy things, but Al-Razi in particular is refuting those things. So he's particularly taking aim at Al-Wahidi before him, who had gone to some length to argue that some inappropriate things had occurred. But then Al-Razi is saying this is absolutely wrong. And after saying it's absolutely wrong with some other evidences, he then says, well, let's now look at the wording itself and consider how to interpret it. So he says, we will discuss this in two stages. Al-kalamu ala zahiri hadhihi al-aya yaqa'u fi maqamain. So in the first place, he wants to say, let's negate that ham altogether. And then for the second maqam, he's going to say, well, what if we accept that the ham did occur? Then is there a way to interpret that which makes it appropriate? So we'll go through both things, although the first thing is صلب الموضوع. This is the core of what we really want to talk about. So he says, the first stage is to say, we do not concede that Joseph had any ham, or that is to say resolve, or intent, or desire towards her. The evidence for this is that God said, وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرَّآ بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. So I think this is adapted from Mustafa Khattab's translation. And he would have done likewise had he not seen a sign from his Lord. In this sentence, the jawab, the apodosis of lawla, has been placed in the advanced position, right? So وَهَمَّ بِهَا is functioning as the Y. Remember we said, were it not for X, then Y. So the Y has been brought forward. Okay, as it says, وَجَوَابُ لَوْلَا هَا هُنَا مُقَدَّمٌ وهو كما يقال قد كنت من الهالكين لولا أن فلانا قد كنت من الهالكين لولا أن فلانا خلصك, right? Or خلصك, right? So it has saved you. You would have perished were it not for لولا, that person saving you. So that is the first proposition. He then says that this is not entirely without objection. So Az-Zajjaj, no small figure in Quranic language and Arab, raised two objections to this interpretation. First, to place the jawab of lawla before lawla is considered shadh. That is to say, it is not found in eloquent speech, only in sometimes these things for poetic license, or found in the speech of some people who are less than eloquent. The second objection is that the apodosis of lawla should be accompanied by a lam, so it should have said then, وَلَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرَّآ بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. Okay, and then Razi mentions the third objection, that if there were no ham at all, then what would be the point in saying لَوْلَا أَرَّآ بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ? This would not be needed if it just if she desired him and he had no desire for her, so there's nothing more to say about it, right? So let's see how he answers these points. He says, yes, putting the jawab of lawla after it is good, but that does not mean that there's anything wrong with putting it before. Okay. إلا أن جوازه لا يمنع من جواز تقديم هذا الجواب. And then he mentions from Sibawayh that generally the Arabs would give priority to the most important item for mention. Therefore, the matter of advancing and delaying is permissible according to the proportions of importance. Then it should not be the case that we say about lawla specifically that its jawab has to come after, right? So if the jawab and things like this can move around due to their importance, then there should be no problem with the jawab of lawla coming before lawla. For the apodosis of lawla to be accompanied by the lam is permissible, but this does not mean it has to come always with lam, right? It can come without. And then he gives the example, إن كادت لتبدي به لولا أن ربطنا على قلبها, in Surah Al-Qasas, which you mentioned earlier. So this counters both issues, he says. The jawab of Lawlā is coming before, as he says. So I guess there could still be discussion about, is this the actual jawab of Lawlā, or is it the thing that gives meaning to the jawab of Lawlā? But here, because of the nature of Lawlā, it has to be the actual jawab of Lawlā, because otherwise we would still be affirming it and then negating it. Right? I hope this point comes across clear. With law, just law as a separate harf, okay? So lawla is in a way composed of law and la, right? If you go down deep, it has that in it. But law operates as a different harf, and you can have the jawab before, or certainly what's in the meaning of the jawab before. Right, so regarding the third point, which Razi himself raised from somebody else, what is the benefit of saying لولا أن رأى برهان ربه, if there was no ham altogether? He says it shows that his lack of ham for her was not due to a lack of sexual drive or interest in women. Rather, it was due to the proofs in God's religion which forbade him from that act. So that's what's understood from Burhan Rabbi. So it tells us that he would have had the ham were it not for the fact that لولا أن رأى برهان ربه, this occurred, and therefore he did not have that desire. After this, we say, as a positive case for this taqdeem of jawab al-lawla, lawla requires an apodosis. This explicit clause is suitable for that function. Therefore, we ought to conclude that it is the apodosis, instead of resorting to a claim of ellipsis. Instead of saying that the jawab is something else that comes after and hasn't been mentioned, why not just look at the thing that is mentioned? One might point out that such ellipsis of the apodosis, making the jawab mahdhuf, is frequent. It happens a lot in the Quran. But he says, in response to this, that, okay, but the default is for it to be made explicit. Moreover, it is only appropriate to leave that unstated if there is something in the text which allows it to be identified. And that is not the case here if we assume it to be elliptical. What we have here are various items which could be elliptical, but none of them is worthier of being elliptical than any other. This shows that the point does not apply here, and God knows best. Let me just see if I can quote you his point here. فإنها هنا أنواعا من الإضمارات يحسن إضمار كل واحد منها وليس إضمار بعضها أولى من إضمار الباقي فظهر الفرق. So it's as if to say, with these various items, why would we assume the jawab is just a kind of a more detailed way of making the point from earlier, that if there's anything to be missing, why would the jawab be missing when you've got something which functions very well as the jawab? So then he says, if we concede that the ham did in fact obtain, then he simply says, well, the ham in that case is not something blameworthy, right? So what it could be is that the ham is a type of intention, a qasd. What is that intention about then? He says, the people who accuse Yusuf alayhi salam of various things, they say that it was resolved to perform indecency. But he says that, look, we can understand it in a different way. The first of this, هم بدفعها عن نفسه ومنعها عن ذلك القبيح لأن الهم هو القصد. So he resolved to push her away and to defend himself and to push away the evil. So that's to say, if we say that there was ham, and that lawla is a separate sentence, then that ham could be understood as something completely different from her hum. So her hum of him was the desire to perform indecency, and his hum was the resolve to defend himself. So the expression hamam to be fulan, I resolve concerning so and so, may mean in fact to strike or push. One may object, as he says, upon this interpretation, there's no benefit in had he not seen a sign from his Lord. But he says, it implies that God informed Joseph that if he should push her, she would kill him or have her attendants kill him. Therefore, God told him that it is better not to use physical force against her for his own survival. Or if Joseph were to set about pushing her away, she might catch hold of him. This would result in his shirt being torn from the front. You see, he's thinking quite deeply here, right? Whereas what had to happen for him to be cleared of that accusation that was to come is that his shirt would be torn from the back. So it was better not to engage in any kind of confrontation, but rather to flee for the door, as he in fact did. Another way is to say, well, the hum is physical attraction, right? But in this, there is nothing wrong. He had a physical attraction or an internal temptation, hadithun nafs. And then the way that he explains this matter is to say, well, if someone is fasting in the height of summer, he comes across some freshing rose water. I like to think of this as a cool ruafsa, right? How does he say it here? إذا رأى الجلاب المبرد بالمثلج. Okay, so then he says, you know, your nature would make you want to drink it. There's nothing wrong with that wanting, but your religiosity and the guidance of God would prevent you from doing anything. In fact, the stronger this temptation becomes, the more perfect and praiseworthy is the strength he shows in fulfilling the dictates of servitude. Okay, so that's an introduction to what's happening in Surah Yusuf, verse 24. Now let's take a look at the translations of this ayah. And when we're doing that, I'm going to show you a website that I often use for comparing translations. This is islamawakened.com. And on this website, you can find, I didn't count exactly, but some 60 plus translations, and the website continues to grow. So that's a very useful resource. May Allah reward those who are working on it. So if we look at ayah 24, what's interesting is that the translators, almost to a man and women, have gone with the view that hamma biha is the jawab for lawla, right? So if we're going to ignore Muhammad Asad for a moment because he's the exception to this. So Pickthall, she verily desired him and he would have desired her. Yusuf Ali, he would have desired her. Khattab, he would have done likewise. Kaskas follows Muhammad Asad, right? But in fact, he tells us that he does that. Wahidudun Khan, he would have succumbed to her. This is strange because he kind of misses out the hamma biha part. Shakir, he would have made for her. That's how he's understanding ham. Bakhtiyar was about to act on her desire for him, and he was about to act on his desire for her. That's all the ham, okay? Was about to, right? So didn't. Irving, he would have had her on his mind, yeah? He would have inclined. Study Quran, he would have inclined. Would have. This, kind of doesn't make sense. She desired him and he desired her had he not. Right? Because, did he desire or did he not desire? It becomes completely unclear. And that's what we're going to see happens much more frequently in ayah 94. Right? So I don't have to go through all of them. He might have desired had he not seen. Let's see any others. He would have inclined to her had he not seen. Abdul Halim, he would have succumbed to her if he had not seen. So here he's changing the ham, if you like, towards succumbing, which is understandable, but a little bit controversial. But Muhammad Asad has, indeed, she desired him, and he desired her. So he understands وَهَمَّ بِهَا as a positive statement. But this bit in brackets, and he would have succumbed, this is the jawab of Lawlā, which is mahdhuf, and therefore he puts it in brackets. So had he not seen in this temptation an evidence of his sustainer''s truth, he would have succumbed. So that's how he understands the whole thing. Kaskas, as we've seen, is a follower of Asad in much of his translation. One other that's an outlier, as I noticed earlier, was this one. Let's see if I can find. Quran Farid is not here on this site, but there's another one which I have mentioned in the other presentation. Now, let me pull it up for you. So in this presentation of the untranslated Quran, I had mentioned this other outlier, but I didn't talk about it there. So this is from Qadiani Ahmadi translator. And what's interesting is that he translates it quite along the lines of one of the things we read from Razi. So she made up her mind with regard to him to seduce him, and he made up his mind with regard to her to resist her, right? Hamma bidaf'iha wa man'iha. Then he sees the Lawlā as a new sentence. If he had not seen manifest sign of his Lord, and then the jawab of Lawlā, he puts in brackets, he could not have shown such determination. So that's the other way to understand it. Or, what I'm saying is that it's another version of the translation, which is based on seeing the Lawlā as having a jawab mahdhuf, that is to say, an elliptical apodosis. So let's come back to our original share of the document, because we're going to consider now what happens in ayah 94. And actually, this is the kind of core of what I'm wanting to talk about. This is the ayah which has got my interest and which I have been following up and following through with numerous translations and then tafsirs in order to try and find out what's going on. So in these comments, I'm talking here about how in the story, which we have in Surah Yusuf, the caravan has departed from Egypt back towards where Sayyidina Yaqub is waiting with some of his other relatives. And he says to them that I can certainly pick up the scent of Joseph. And that's because they were bringing the shirt which he has sent with his brothers to put over his father's face and to bring him back to sight. So he says, Inni la'ajidu riha Yusuf, and then Lawlā an tufannidūni. Were it not that you consider me senile. That would be the translation according to what we learned earlier about Lawlā. Okay, but some could understand this. You could say also, were it not that you will consider me senile, right? And that's where the translators have generally gone, but they've also gone in some very strange directions and some very questionable directions, and certainly not shown the basis for their interpretations. What's interesting here in the in the Mus'haf text, you might find it like this, with this marker saying continue here, and possibly the reason that that's been put there is because the readers and scholars considered that Lawlā is intimately connected to what's before. Why is it intimately connected? Because maybe they thought that this part functions as the jawab of it. But that's what I'm really going to argue against based on tafsirs. So let's see what happens in the sort of tradition of tafsir. And to get to that, there's another website which I want to show you, a very important one that I make use of from time to time. And that is الجامع التاريخي لتفسير القرآن الكريم. You can find it on mubdi.com. Mubdi with two eyes. Mubdi. And here you can select any particular ayah. In this case, I've selected ayah 94. Okay, here we are. Something happened to the numbers, they've gone backwards, I don't know why. But the site works very well. Basically, you can select whichever tafsirs you want to be looking at, and then you can open them up and see what was said in chronological order. So you go to the earliest tafsirs and you can look through. So I've done this a while back. I've gone through all of the tafsirs that are available here, which are just about everything that's available even in print nowadays. And I pulled out anything that they were saying about the structure and the grammar of Lawlā and tufannidūni. And then I've arranged it in this document in a different way, but I'm still maintaining to a certain extent this idea of chronology, because I want to get the picture of how things have developed over time and who's taken from whom. So what I'm telling you at the beginning is not actually the earliest tafsir, but one which is pivotal, that is the Kashaf of Zamakhshari. So his Hijri death date is 538. So we find that the majority of Mufassirin follow him in saying and spelling out that there is a jawab of Lawlā which is mahdhuf, and these are the taqdeers that they have mentioned. So this is what I'm calling the standard taqdeers. So Zamakhshari says, وَالْمَعْنَى لَوْلَا تَفْنِيدُكُمْ إِيَّايَ لَصَدَّقْتُمُونِي. Were it not for your calling me, or the fact that you call me senile, and there's other ways of translating it, but that's the basic idea. Were it not for that, you would have believed me, or you would believe me. So I've kind of glossed that in a way. If it weren't for the fact that you disbelieve everything I say, you would believe me on this point, especially because I'm more certain about this than I have been about just about anything else I've ever said to you. We can find the same in the Tafsir of An-Nasafi, Nishapuri, As-Suyuti, which is in the Jalalain, and Abu Saud. You can simply find them providing exactly the same. If we look at the Tafsir of Al-Baydawi, which of course is based largely on Zamakhshari, he says the same thing, but then he says, or لَقُلْتُ إِنَّهُ قَرِيب. The other possible taqdeer is, were it not for the fact you call me senile, I would say that he's nearby. So the implication is, I do smell this, but I'm not going to go as far as telling you something which you're not going to believe anyway, right? But that's a separate additional point, right? So you notice here he's not saying لولا أن تفندوني لقلت إني لأجد ريح يوسف, right? It's not this part that's in doubt. The part that he's holding back from saying, according to this other view, is that Yusuf himself is actually nearby, or he's approaching. We can find also in Tafsir of Ibn al-Jawzi, and he's quoting somebody else, فيه إضمار تقديره لأخبرتكم أنه حي. So similar, I would tell you he's nearby, I'll tell you he's alive. Abu Hayyan has a very useful clarification. He's quoting Zamakhshari, but he adds more to it. ولولا هنا حرف امتناع لوجود. This is what we said right at the beginning. وجوابها محذوف. He's making that explicit. The jawab is not there in the ayah. قال الزمخشري المعنى لولا تفنيدكم إياي لصدقتموني. وقد يقال تقديره لولا أن تفندوني لأخبرتكم بكونه حيا لم يمت لأن وجداني ريحه دال على حياته. So he just spells out what we've just understood from the likes of Al-Baydawi, from the likes of Ibn al-Jawzi, right? So this is important. You see, the translators don't seem to be aware that there's Jawab Mahdhuf, but the Mufassirin, the most famous Mufassirin, you can see here mentioned, are telling you that quite consistently, and they're telling you what the taqdeer is, or what the various possibilities are. My comment here, right, so similar to what we've seen here, لأخبرتكم بكونه حيا لم يمت. it seems that he is understanding لولا مخافة أن تفندوني لأخبرتكم بكونه حيا. So you could understand, were it not that I fear that you will call me senile, I would tell you this. Right? So that is a possibility. You could go in that direction. And in Mughni al-Labib, which I mentioned at the beginning, that's what As-Suyuti was summarizing from. We do actually find this mentioned near the beginning of his entry on Lawlā. He says, then he says, yes, فَأَمَّا قَوْلُهُ صلى الله عليه وسلم لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك عند كل صلاة. فالتقدير لولا مخافة أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم، أي أمر إيجاب، وإلا لانعكس معناها إذ الممتنع المشقة والموجود الأمر. Right? So if you don't put in, if were it not that I fear that you will call me senile, then the meaning would be reversed. Okay. And what's important is that he doesn't say, were it not that I fear that you call me senile, I would have said that I find the scent of Joseph, right? Which is what the translators almost uniformly do. They do very similar things to that. Sorry, most of the translators do something else, but we have here Muhammad Asad who does exactly this. Muhammad Asad says, behold, were it not that you might consider me a dotard, I would say that's his bracket, I would say that I truly feel the breath of Joseph in the air. So he just does this little maneuver of sticking, I would say that, but it doesn't seem that he has pondered deeply on Lawlā itself. Muhammad Asad does use Az-Zamakhshari, so one would have hoped that he'd seen this. He also uses Al-Razi, but as I said, Al-Razi does not actually put any detail about this expression. He talks about the detail of what is tufannidūni, but he doesn't talk about the grammatical structure. And then Amatul Rahman Umar, if I recall correctly, is part of the Qadiani Ahmadis. If we do not pronounce my judgment to be weak and unsound, let me tell you that I do scent the power of Joseph. So a few slightly strange items there, but the point is that, like Muhammad Asad, this translator has understood, I would have said that. Okay? But they would have said that, not innahu hayyun aw qaribun, but rather I would have said that I find the scent of Joseph. Now you see what the basic problem here is. I will spell it out for you. Inni la ajidu is very emphatic. It's not like earlier when we saw وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرَّأَ بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. It's not like there where هَمَّ بِهَا has come without any emphasis, or even with just the lam, وَلَا هَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرَّأَ, which is possible. But instead it's come with إِنِّي لَأَجِدُ رِيحَ يُوسُف. Okay, so it seems to be a definite statement followed by a lawla statement. Now let's see what happens here. Ibn Ajiba, a much later Mufassir, gives you something which does seem to come to this. I would have said that I smell the scent of Joseph. But that might not be what he means. And we'll see that later when we look at Al-Biqa'i, inshallah. So Ibn Ajiba mentions, after the standard taqdeers above, he says, أي لولا أن تحمقوني, were it not that you would consider me an idiot, لقلت إنه قريب أو لصدقتموني في ذلك, these are the standard taqdeers, أو لولا أن تلوموني وتردوا علي قولي لقلت إنه ريح يوسف. So he said, were it not that you would reject what I'm going to say, I would say it is the rih of Yusuf. So one way we can understand this is, I smell the scent of Joseph, but I'm not saying it is the scent of Joseph. I perceive that it is, but I'm not going to insist to you that that's what it is, because you'll only reject what I'm going to say. So I don't particularly find that a strong way of interpreting it, but in any case, it's not quite along the lines of what Muhammad Asad and others have done. Now, I found one translator, and this is the most recent translator to come into the market, where the jawab has been made explicitly, inni la ajidu riha Yusuf. At least it seems so. It seems that's what the translator has done. So although Muhammad Asad has inserted this, I would say that. Nuh Keller does not insert, I would say that. So let's see his translation. Verily, I find the scent of Joseph, were you not to deem me witless with age. Now, with all respect, I find this to be a sentence in English which does not have a meaning, because it leaves you in a state of contradiction. It leaves you in a state of hayra and bewilderment. The question is, did he find the scent of Joseph or not? Verily, I find. That's emphatic statement. And then you have, were you not to deem me witless with age? So when you have this kind of comma and then the were you not, we understand in English that were you not to deem me witless with age, I would. But that possibility is not there, because were you not to deem me witless with age, verily I find. This does not make sense. What could have happened here is a full stop, verily I find the scent of Joseph. And then were you not to deem me witless with age, followed by a marker, a dash for ellipsis. And that is what the same translator does in other places quite successfully, but missed that in this particular occurrence. Now, some other statements. أولى أخبرتكم خبره لأنه مصدق. This is from the Hashi of Al-Shihab on Al-Bidawi. I'm just giving you here how I understood his statement, although it's not entirely clear to me. If you didn't consider me sinner, I would tell you all about him. And then لأنه مصدق I take as separate. That is, if he felt, if Yaqub felt that he is credible among them, right? Were it not for the fact that you consider me sinner. So in a hypothetical scenario where I'm musaddaq, I would have told you all about him. Al-Qunawi in his Hashia, أو أن مبشره بالقميص قريب مجيئه ووصوله. Very similar to what's above. Hashiatul Jamal on Jalalain spells out nicely the position which first comes from Zamakhshari. وتقدير الكلام لولا تفنيدكم لي موجود. لولا تفنيدكم لي موجود. So that's like spelling out how the harf lawla works. Were it not for the tafnid being existent or occurring and being the case, لصدقتموني, and that is to say, امتنع تصديقكم لي لوجود تفنيدكم لي. Right? So that's the Y has failed to come into existence due to the existence of the X, which is the tafnid. Al-Alusi has said in his tafsir, which takes a great stock of the whole tradition and particularly engages with the Hashia tradition, especially at Shihab. وجواب لولا محذوف أي لولا تفنيدكم إياي لصدقتموني أو لقلت إن يوسف قريب مكانه أو لقاؤه أو نحو ذلك. So he allows here that there could be other ways of putting it. There can be other space for other taqdeers, as long as they make sense in the context and are somehow implied by the ayah and the meaning. So this is what happens if you look through the tafsir tradition. You would find that there is close to unanimity on this, but we're going to see some outliers in a moment, inshallah. So I just want to say here that there's one translation in the whole bunch that I found actually understood that there is jawab muqaddar. And that is the translation of the group of women who go by the name Sahih International. They said, indeed, I find the smell of Joseph and would say that he was alive if you did not think me weakened in mind. So, of course, this could be placed after, I find the smell of Joseph, and if you did not think me weakened in mind, I would say that he was alive. But for just neatness in English, they've moved it earlier. Okay, so that's in terms of existing translations. So far, there's one that follows the standard tafsir. Pretty grim, huh? So let's look at some alternative taqdeers which exist in tafsirs of the 20th century. Now, a very interesting mufassir called Atfiyash, he has a couple of different texts, but one of them seems to be engaging quite closely with Al-Alusi, whom we just mentioned, and he often builds on and comments on things in Al-Alusi. Not so much in this case, but I'm just mentioning that as a benefit for why we might read his work. And I found his comments here to be very interesting and very useful. And I got very excited the first time I read what Atfiyash had to say. So in one of his works, in the more condensed one, he says, وَجَوَابُ لَوْلَا مَحْذُوفٌ أي لَصَدَّقْتُمُونِي أو لَقُلْتُ إِنَّهُ قَرِيب. Okay? And then he points out why the preceding part, yeah, إني لا أجد ريح يوسف, cannot be the جواب. وإنما لم أقدره مما قبلها, right? لأن وجدان ريح يوسف متحقق ولو فندوه. So just very simply, he clarifies that cannot be the case because he is certainly finding the scent of Joseph, and that is not dependent on whether or not they believe him. Then he says in التيسير والجواب محذوف أي لأكثرت التبجح به وأظهرت المبالغة في السرور. That is to say, I'd be really emphatic and overjoyed in the way that I'm reacting to this situation, right? So it's slightly unusual, but again, as Al-Alusi mentioned, there's space for different taqdeers to be considered. Then he makes a criticism of this one. Yeah, he's mentioned it here without any problem, لَصَدَّقْتُمُونِي, but here in التيسير he makes a criticism of it and says, وهذا أولى من أن يقال لقلت إن يوسف في قريب المكان مني أو يقرب اجتماعه بي أو لقلت أن مبشره إلي قريب. These are various things that are mentioned before, as we've seen. وأما أن يقال لصدقتموني فضعيف. Why? لأن وجود التفنيد هو نفس انتفاء التصديق فلا تهم. So his point of view is, well, it's almost like saying, if you didn't disbelieve me, you would believe me. So it ends up being almost meaningless. But that's why, if we see when I first introduced it, I gave a kind of more detailed way of understanding that if it weren't for the case that you disbelieve everything I say, then you would believe me on this. So that is why I say that الطفيش تضعيف of الزمخشري is ضعيف itself. Wallahu a'lam. And I've kind of said this here in the Arabic. Then we have Ibn Ashur. Now, Ibn Ashur is very interesting because he doesn't use the same phrases that earlier mufassirs used, but he does very concisely explain why the preceding phrase isn't jawab here. The A is mahdhufa, right? So he says, وَجَوَابُ لَوْلَا مَحْذُوفٌ دَلَّ عَلَيْهِ التَّأْكِيد. So I don't think he's saying that the ta'keed دَلَّ على الجواب. I think he's saying it دَلَّ على الحذف. Right? The fact that you've got إِنِّي لَأَجِدُ رِيحَ يُوسُف tells you that there is that this is not the jawab. Therefore, the jawab is mahdhuf. It has to be understood from the context. Right? أي لولا أن تفندوني لتحققتم ذلك. Now this is very interesting because there's more than one meaning of the word تحققتم, and I'm not entirely sure which way Ibn Ashur wants to go here. So someone who's more conservative might say تحققتم can simply mean the same as صدقتموني, so it would be like you would be sure of what I'm saying, you would believe me, right? That's possible, but I think he's pointing to something else, and that's another way of understanding دل عليه التأكيد. So him saying إني لأجد ريح يوسف, right? That I'm definitely picking up the scent of Joseph. So what does he understand? Therefore, it's so clear, the smell of Joseph is so strong, in fact, that you would also smell it if you weren't people who are disposed to disbelief, right, and rejection, and if you didn't consider everything coming out my mouth to be nonsense, right? So I think that Ibn Ashur is going in this direction, and I like this interpretation very much. أي لولا أن تفندوني لتحققتم ذلك, right? You would not just, you would believe me, but that you would actually realize that, you would actually detect that yourself, you would experience that yourself. That's another meaning of تحقق. So that's what I understand from Ibn Ashur. Also from Sayyid Qutb, who, his commentary في ظلال القرآن was of a similar time period. There's a little bit of اضطراب in the wording. I'm not 100% sure that he's saying this, but it certainly seems that way. لصدقتم معي ما أجده من ريح الغائب البعيد. So I was checking some editions to see, is it really صدقتم or صدقتم? Is it actually صادفتم, something that you would experience or encounter with me? I'm not sure, but I just find it like this in all the copies that I've managed to look at. لصدقتم معي ما أجده, you would believe along with me what I experience. So it's almost like you would also find it, you would also experience it. ولكن المحيطين بيعقوب لم يكن لهم ما له عند ربه فلم يجدوا ما وجد من رائحة يوسف. So it sounds a lot like he's saying that the point is they didn't experience what he experienced because they considered him senile. And that is the point that I am understanding also from Ibn Ashur. Right. وأراه في غاية الحسن. As I'll show you at the end the translation that myself and Ustad Nu'man Ali Khan have, in our draft version, at least at this point in time, have got for this. فالتحقق مرتبة أرقى من التصديق. Right, I want to show you some other taqdeers which are somewhat more problematic. So let's start with Tabarsi or Tabrisi. There's two ways of saying his name. Shi'i commentator of quite early period, around the time of Zamakhshari as well. I would be sure of it. So he says, وتقديره إني أقطع أنها ريح يوسف لولا أن تفندوني. Right? And later on, Ash-Shawkani goes with something very similar. أخبرهم يعقوب بأن الصبا, this is in reference to the wind, right? Is it صبا or صبا? I'm not sure. قد حملت إليه روح حبيبه. So I said روح, didn't I? Yeah? قد حملت إليه ريح حبيبه وأنه لولا ما يخشاه من التفنيد لما شك في ذلك. So as we've noted before, that مخافة أن تفندون, so لولا ما يخشاه من التفنيد. So were it not for the fact that you will, or was it not for the fear that you will call me senile, I wouldn't doubt that. But my comment on this in a way is something that I've already made. كيف يفهم الشك من جملة مؤكدة بإن واللام, right? And that's what Ibn Ashur also has pointed out before, right? So I certainly find the smell of Joseph, but not that I fear that you will call me senile. I would be sure that it is Yusuf. I'm not so sure about this idea. Now, Al-Biqa'i, always interesting, always special, has noted this issue of the ta'keed. So he gives us it like this. قال أبوهم لولد ولده, because it's not his direct children who are there with him. Mostly it is their families. ومن حوله من أهله مؤكدا لعلمه أنهم ينكرون قوله إني لأجد أي لأقول إني لأجد ريح يوسف. So he's saying that the reason for the inna is to counter their inherent disbelief of things that he says, and he knows that this in particular is not going to be easily believable, so he uses inna. That's a well-known sort of rule in علم المعاني, right? مؤكدا لعلمه أنهم ينكرون قوله, right? But then he says the jawab is, I would say it without hesitation, right? So that sounds similar to what Muhammad Asad has gone with, but I'm going to insist that it's something different. وصدهم عن مواجهته بالإنكار بقوله لولا أن تفندوني أي لقلت غير مستح ولا متوقف. Okay. لأن التفنيد لا يمنع الوجدان. This is important. So it's not it can't be the jawab itself, right? Because it can't be, were it not for your tafneed, I would smell it. But he's saying, were it not for your tafneed, I would say it. But it's not this, he is saying it, right? And Al-Biqa'i knows that. So he's saying, I certainly find the scent of Joseph. And were it not for the fact that you disbelieve me, I would insist that it's the scent of Joseph, right? So there is a kind of, we've seen something along these lines from some others. وهو كما تقول لصاحبك لولا أن تنسبني إلى الخفة لقلت كذا أي إني قائل به مع علمي بأنك لا توافقني عليه. So he gives you the kind of sense of the phrase, and the sense of the phrase is, I am saying it, but, or even though I know that you will disagree with me. And here is where we see a number of translations that have gone with this kind of meaning. And I want to, of course, clarify, I'm not suggesting at all that George Sale was reading Burhanuddin al-Biqa'i, nor Pickthall, nor any of the others. It's always conceivable that some of them, especially the later ones, might have read al-Biqa'i on this, but that's not what I'm suggesting happened. Rather, that Al-Biqa'i has looked at it from a particular angle, and a lot of the translators looked at it from that same angle. But most of the Mufassirin did not, right? So, in George Sale, we have, verily I perceive, although ye think. Truly I am conscious, Pickthall, though ye call. Sher Ali, surely I perceive, even though. Dawood, I feel, though you will not believe me. And so on and so on. And this is an unfortunate one, if you like, because Adl Salahi, Hafidhullah, is the translator for Sayyid Qutb. And we saw what Qutb's opinion seemed to be, but the translation does not reflect that. The translation does not reflect what Sayyid Qutb seemed to understand from it. Some of them used the word might also. They said, for example, this is Farid Ansari, it's, Zafar Ansari, the translator for Maududi from Urdu to English. Indeed, I smell the fragrance of Joseph, I say so, although you may think that I'm doting. The Muntakhab fi Tafsir, the Azhari project, I do perceive, albeit you people might think, not really the right usage of albeit, but Itani, I sense the presence of Joseph, though you may think, right? This is what I'm emphasizing here, that some of them have this might. You may think I'm Sino, but I can smell Joseph. Abdul Halim. You may think I'm Sino, but I can certainly sense the smell of Joseph. Right? So you could say that these translations have gone along the lines of Al-Biqa'i, and that is a good makhraj for them. Finally, I think it's finally, non-jawab readings of Lawlā. Okay, I think I lost a bit of my document, which I'll pull up shortly. أقوالا تجعل لولا غير امتناعية. So this is interesting that we have some opinions where Lawlā is suggested to be not the Lawlā which is for امتناع للوجود, right? So these are very late tafsirs, these ones, Al-Qasimi, Abu Zahra, modern mufassirs. Al-Qasimi understood it as illa. because he says here وقوله لولا أن تفندوني بمعنى إلا أنكم تفندوني. And then he says, similar to Zamakhshari, أو لولاه لصدقتموني. So based on this, it looks like he looked in Tafsir before. But where did he get this? إلا أنكم تفندوني. Al-Qasimi, to a large extent, is based on Shawkani, but he doesn't say the same as Shawkani here. Abu Zahra says, أي إلا أن تنسبوني إلى الفند. Okay, and then he says, ولولا حرف شرط وتعليق وجوابه محذوف أي لولا أن تفندوني لصدقتم ولا آمنتم بالحق. So that's quite standard. وتقدير التفنيد لعقليتهم غير المدركة لا للأمر في الذات. Anyway, so the point is that he also mentions this إلا meaning, and we had seen something along those lines in the original excerpt from As-Suyuti, but here's the comment here. So they might have understood illa on the sense of lakin, because illa, if it's istithna munqati', a disconnected exception, is understood as but. So there are translations that go with but, of course. كلاهما ذكر التقدير الزمخشري. Okay, بمعنى لكن فيكون حاصله قريبا مما ذكرنا عن البقاع. So then it would be similar to what we've just seen here, the but, right? So it ends up the same as that, even though it is not the same grammatical interpretation. أو هو المحظور من جعل الشطر الأول في مكان الجواب. Okay, so the thing that I'm saying is not allowed is to consider it the jawab. And then we have got here Tabatabai and another Shi'i tafsir of the 20th century, which is led by Ayatollah Shirazi. So then they understand it as if it's to be إذا لم تفندوني. And I can only understand this as almost as if لولا أن was switched around to become لو أن لا. That's the suggestion for how to understand maybe what's happened here in their interpretation. الطباطبائي says قال أبوهم يعقوب لمن عنده من بنيه إني لأجد ريح يوسف لولا أن ترموني بضعف الرأي، أي إني لا أحس إني لا أحس بريحه وأرى أن اللقاء قريب ومن حقه أن تذعنوا بما أجده لولا أن تخطئوني لكن من المحتمل أن تفندوني فلا تذعنوا بقولي. So it kind of goes round and round a little bit in this sentence, but it's almost like unless you reject my statement and call me senile. إن الأمثل من مادة الفند معناها العجز الفكري والسفاهة مضى بعض اللغويين إلى أن معناها الكذب. Okay, فبناء على ذلك فإن جملة لولا أن تفندوني معناها إذا لم تتهموني. So here it's clear that he's got the تقدير of إذا لم تتهموني, unless you do, بالسفاهة وفساد العقل. So many of the translations have gone with a variation on this. If you do not call me senile, if you do not consider me weak, I sense the scent of Joseph, if you will not consider me a dotard. I sense the fragrance of Yusuf, if you do not take me to be senile. So these are all sentences that make sense in the English language, but they do not match really the nature of this ayah, because the ayah itself has got the ta'keed. I do sense it, not I would, if you don't take me senile, then I will. his sensing the fragrance of Joseph is not dependent on whether they believe him or not. This is what I keep emphasizing over and over again. I sent the power of Joseph if you call me not a dotard. Okay, Muhammad Ali from the Lahori Ahmadis. So sometimes some variations in their way of taking certain key terms. Who else? Study Quran. Truly, I sense the scent of Joseph if you think me not see now. So if you think me not, truly I sense. Finally, we'll look at some opinions which actually precede Az-Zamakhshari, which doesn't mean that they are any better or any worse, but they do not fit with the general trend in the works of tafsir. So Al-Maturidi, who's a very important figure in theology, but also well regarded for his tafsir Ta'wilat Ahl Sunnah, has got some discussion about this, which is very unusual. So by that, I'm also pointing out that other mufassirin who might have read his work didn't adopt the same thing that he said. And I'm going to suggest that it's good that they didn't adopt it because it doesn't seem to be on the mark. So, of course, this is min al-mufassirin typo there. So he says, وَقَوْلُ تَعَالَى لَوْلَا إِذَا كَانَ عَلَى الْإِبْتِدَاءِ فَهُوَ عَلى النَّهِي. So if it's like a new kind of sentence here, then لا تفندوني, it means don't consider me senile. In our previous survey of the different uses of lawla, we did not see any nahi. And if this exists at all, then we need to find some shahid or some examples of that usage, whether it be in the Quran or whether it be in other literature, in pre-Islamic poetry or whatever it may be. And until now, I have not come across whatever evidence there is for la for lawla for nahi, for forbidding. However, we see here a number of translations that adopt that. And I'm not suggesting, of course, that they got it from Al-Maturidi, but perhaps he provides them some authority at least. So Yusuf Ali says, I do indeed scent the presence of Joseph. Nay, think me not a dotard. So he's saying, don't consider me a dotard. Khan Hilali, I've put here, I'm not so sure that this is a nahi. If only you think me not a dotard, it could fit in somewhere else. But these are several translations that adopted this nahi meaning. But then he says, وَإِنْ كَانَ عَلَى الْخَبَرِ فَهُوَ عَلَى النَّفِي. So nafi is just negation. كَقَوْلِهِ فَلَوْلَا كَانَتْ قَرْيَةٌ آمَنَتْ. So this ayah was discussed previously. We saw that Al-Harawi considered it to be a case of nafi. But the others criticized that and said, no, it should be seen as the general lawla for tawbih, right? Which contains within it a kind of nafi, right? Because from that we understand that they did not believe, and that's why they're being blamed. And moreover, if we were to apply this nafi meaning to the ayah, then what would that give us? Let's go back and just look at the ayah a little bit. So if it is negating, then it says, إِنِّي لَأَجِدُ رِيحَ يُوسُف لَوْلَا أَن تُفَنِّدُونَ means that you don't consider me senile. You don't consider me senile. So how does that fit then in the meaning of the ayah? Al-Maturidi does not really spell out for us quite what he takes it to mean, therefore. So we do have the meanings of ard and tahdid, but not nafi exactly, but certainly not nahi, right? Min lawazim al-ma'na, as I'm saying here, and I don't see that it fits in the context. We also have Al-Mawardi a little bit later on. Mawardi mentions اعتذار ثم اعتذر فقال لولا أن تفندوني. It's not entirely clear what he means by that, but it might correspond to what some of the translators have kind of gone with, something like, unless you do kind of almost apologizing for his view rather than standing by it. Wal-Qushayri, it seems that he's also taken the nahi. Al-Qushayri's discussion of this is actually very interesting. But then, this is the core part of it. He says here, قوله جل ذكره لولا أن تفندوني تفرس فيهم أنهم يبسطون لسان الملامة فلم ينجع فيهم قوله فزادوا في الملامة. So it's almost like he's saying, he sensed that they're going to do a tafnid of him. They're going to reject and refute his statement. And then he said something to them to prevent them doing so. But this was unsuccessful, so they blamed him some more after this ayah, right? So between the lines, I understand him to be reading it also almost as nahi or just something close to nahi, but he doesn't explain the grammatical basis for that. So finally, the translation which is in my draft along with Ustad Norman, the Bayina translation. This is a draft which we'll discuss some more and open to feedback from the public as well. But we're saying here, when the traveling party got out of the city, their father said, I'm surely picking up Joseph's scent. If you didn't consider me senile, you would too. So this is along the lines of what I've understood from Ibn Ashur, rahimahullah. And even if he didn't mean that, I think it is a very good meaning, which is an extension of the very common statement, لَصَدَّقْتُمُونِي. It's almost like saying, not only would you believe me, but you would actually then, if you believe me, just sniff the air. You wouldn't just say, oh, you can smell that. You would say, okay, let me see if I can smell it. And if you were to try to smell it, I believe, it's like between the lines Yaqub is saying, I believe the smell is actually so clear and so strong that you could smell it too if you bothered to try. And certainly if you had within you some of the belief that I have, some of the faith that I have. Because, of course, him detecting that smell contains something miraculous, something out of the ordinary, to smell someone's shirt at such a distance. But the miracle need not be restricted to him. It could also be that others in his family, if they also had that faith and that hope, that they would also smell that good news carried on the shirt. And Allah knows best his meaning. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.